What if I told you that one of the most chilling UFO encounters in American history didn't happen in Roswell, didn't happen in some remote desert, but high up in the Colorado Rockies, where a group of climbers went face to face with something not from this earth, and one of them never returned? This isn't a campfire tale or an urban legend. It's a true story, pieced together from survivor testimonies, missing persons reports, and a single piece of footage that was never meant to be seen by the public. It all began in the summer of 1997, when four young climbers set out to scale one of the most dangerous and least documented peaks in the Rockies. Locals called it the Devil's Tooth, a jagged spire of granite surrounded by endless wilderness. Even seasoned mountaineers avoided it. The Ute people, who had lived in the region for centuries, whispered about sky spirits who descended in glowing orbs to take humans away. Most people dismissed the legends. But for these four, Jake, the ambitious leader, Eric, his lifelong friend, Laura, a sharp geologist, and Sarah, a quiet photographer, the only thing that mattered was the climb. The first day was perfect. They filmed themselves laughing as they hiked through the forests, carrying heavy packs filled with ropes, ice axes, and cameras. The documentary they planned was supposed to show their triumph on the summit. But by the time they reached their first campsite, things had already started to go wrong. Eric was the first to notice it, a low hum in the air, like standing near giant power lines. Except there were no power lines for miles. At first, Jake brushed it off. "It's the wind," he said, though his own compass needle twitched strangely in his hand. Sarah, who filmed constantly, caught flickers of light darting above the ridge, pinpoints that moved in sharp, geometric patterns, unlike any plane. She joked nervously that maybe they were UFOs auditioning for the camera. Nobody laughed. By the second day, their equipment began to fail. Compasses spun uselessly. Their GPS flickered out. Even watches seemed to tick irregularly, as if time itself was bending. Laura tried to rationalize it. "Magnetite deposits," she muttered. "The mountain must have unusual mineral fields." But deep down, none of them believed it. Something about the mountain felt wrong. That night, they pitched their tents near a cliffside ledge. The wilderness was so silent it made their ears ring. No owls, no wind, just emptiness. Then, at exactly 2:37 a.m., the silence shattered. A metallic boom, louder than thunder, sharper than any explosion, ripped across the sky. The climbers bolted out of their tents, and what they saw froze them in place. Hovering just above the ridge was a massive triangular craft. Blacker than the night sky, it seemed to swallow the stars behind it. Three blinding white lights glowed at its corners, and at the center pulsed a deep, ominous red. The ground vibrated under their boots. The air felt charged, like static before lightning. Nobody could speak. Nobody could move. Sarah's trembling camera recorded everything. The object shifting silently through the air, then stopping directly above them. A beam of bluish-white light burst downward, striking the rocks less than 100 feet away. Eric screamed. Before the others could react, the beam swung toward him, and in an instant, he was gone. One moment he stood beside them, shouting in disbelief. The next, he was ripped off the ground, pulled upward into the light. His cry cut short as his body vanished into the craft's belly. Laura lunged forward, shrieking his name, but Jake grabbed her arm and dragged her back. Sarah dropped to her knees, sobbing, the camera still rolling. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the craft tilted, pulsed brighter, and shot into the sky. Within seconds it was gone, leaving behind only silence, a faint ozone smell, and a team of climbers now reduced to 3. They didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Laura sat staring at the place where Eric had stood. Sarah rocked back and forth, whispering, "He's gone, he's gone, he's gone." Jake, pale and shaking, tried to keep control. At dawn, he said the only thing that made sense. "We have to get off this mountain. Now." But when they tried to descend, they discovered something impossible. The narrow path they had climbed the day before no longer existed. Not blocked, not covered, gone. The rock face itself looked different, as though the mountain had reshaped itself overnight. as if they had woken up in a place that wasn't entirely Earth anymore. The morning after Eric vanished, the three remaining climbers, Jake, Laura, and Sarah, stood frozen at the cliffside, staring at the landscape that had betrayed them. Where the switchback trail had once wound down into the valley, there was nothing but sheer rock. Not hidden by snow, not eroded, just gone, as though the mountain had rewritten itself overnight. Laura, the geologist, whispered in disbelief. "This is impossible. Rocks don't change in hours." But the evidence was before their eyes, a mocking reminder that they were trapped. Jake tried to take control, insisting they would find another path, but every step downward only made things worse. The forest looked wrong, as if arranged by an unseen hand. Pines grew in strange alignments, trunks scorched with spirals of blackened bark. No birds sang. The air carried a faint metallic hum, sometimes growing louder, sometimes fading, but never fully gone. By noon they stopped to rest, exhausted. Sarah clutched her camera like a weapon, whispering that she had replayed the footage, and Eric's scream still echoed in the audio even after he was gone. Jake snapped at her to stop, saying the only thing that mattered was survival. But deep down, even he knew there was no logic to what was happening. When night fell again, none of them dared to sleep. Laura thought she saw figures watching them from the tree line, tall silhouettes standing unnaturally still. When she blinked, they were gone. Around 3 a.m., the hum intensified until the ground itself vibrated. Sarah pointed toward the ridge, and all three of them saw it. Not the massive triangular craft this time, but smaller orbs of light, maybe 5 or 6, hovering low between the trees. They moved in patterns, darting and circling like intelligent predators. Jake hissed for them to turn off their headlamps. They crouched in darkness, hearts pounding, as one of the orbs drifted closer, illuminating the rocks in a cold, bluish glow. For a moment it hovered barely 20 feet away, and in its light they saw something horrific. Eric's climbing jacket, torn and shredded, hanging from a branch. There was no body, just the jacket, still wet as if it had been returned only moments earlier. Sarah muffled a scream, and instantly the orb snapped toward them, as though it had heard. Then, without warning, it shot upward and vanished into the sky, followed by the others. Silence returned, but the terror did not leave with it. At dawn, Jake made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to descend, they would push upward, toward the summit, in hopes that a clearer view would reveal an escape route. Laura argued furiously, but in the end there was no choice. The mountain below seemed warped, untrustworthy, and they all felt watched no matter which direction they turned. As they climbed higher, Sarah began to deteriorate. She whispered constantly, claiming she could hear Eric calling her name, his voice thin and distorted, sometimes coming from the rocks, sometimes from the wind. At one point she stopped altogether and stared into the distance, murmuring, "He's waiting for us, up there." Jake had to shake her violently to keep her moving. By late afternoon, they reached a high plateau. That was when they discovered something that froze them to the core. A perfect circle burned into the rock, 30 feet wide, its surface blackened and smooth as glass. In the center lay metallic fragments, twisted and sharp, glowing faintly with residual heat. Laura knelt to examine one and recoiled instantly, because the shard was humming, vibrating in her hands, as though alive. She dropped it, and the sound it made was unlike any metal she had ever heard, a resonant tone that echoed in their bones. Then Sarah screamed. She pointed toward the far side of the plateau, where a shape stood half hidden in the mist. It was tall, too tall, at least 7 feet, with long, thin limbs and a head that seemed slightly too large for its body. For a fraction of a second it remained still, as if studying them. Then, in a blink, it was gone, dissolving into the haze. Laura collapsed, sobbing, insisting she hadn't imagined it. Jake forced them onward, though his face was pale and drenched with sweat. He muttered that they had to keep moving, that whatever was up here wasn't human, and that staying in one place was suicide. Night fell again before they could reach the summit. They huddled in the open, too afraid to set tents. Above them, the sky was unnaturally clear, filled with more stars than they had ever seen. But then, one by one, some of those stars began to move. Sarah filmed it all, her hands shaking so badly the footage blurred. Dozens of points of light shifting, aligning into patterns, rotating like a massive machine spread across the heavens. Laura whispered, "They're watching us." And for once Jake didn't argue. Because deep down, he knew she was right. By the third night on the mountain, the three survivors were no longer thinking about reaching the summit or descending to safety. They were thinking only about lasting until sunrise, though each sunrise felt less like salvation and more like a brief pause in a nightmare that refused to end. Jake tried to keep them moving, but every direction felt wrong. Trails shifted, landmarks vanished, and sometimes the mountains seemed to twist beneath their feet, forcing them back to the same place no matter how far they climbed. Laura, exhausted and trembling, began to say aloud what all of them were thinking. "We're not in the same place anymore. This isn't just Colorado. They've taken us somewhere else." Sarah barely responded. She filmed constantly, whispering to Eric as if the camera could send her voice into whatever dimension he had been dragged to. Around midday, they stumbled upon something that made Jake's blood run cold. A campsite. Not theirs, but another, long abandoned. Rusted climbing gear lay scattered, tents shredded by weather, and a metal mug half buried in dirt. Laura examined it and whispered that the logo stamped into the steel belonged to an expedition from 1982, a team that had vanished without a trace. Sarah filmed everything, muttering that Eric wasn't the first, that there had been others before them. Before Jake could answer, the metallic hum filled the air again, louder than ever. The trees around them vibrated, dust cascaded from the cliffs, and then the sky darkened unnaturally, as though a shadow had spread across the sun. They looked up and saw it, the same triangular craft, enormous, blotting out the heavens. But this time it didn't keep its distance. It descended, slow and deliberate, until its edges loomed above them like the walls of a black fortress. The sound was deafening, not mechanical but organic, like the groan of something alive. Jake screamed at the others to run, but there was nowhere to go. A beam of light cut down from the craft, scanning across the rocks like a searchlight. Wherever it touched, the ground steamed and warped, leaving scorched patterns behind. The three of them ducked behind a boulder, hearts pounding so loud they were sure the thing could hear them. The beam passed, hovered, then retracted. Moments later, the craft shot upward and vanished again with impossible speed. Silence returned, but now the ground where the beam had touched glowed faintly, radiating heat. Sarah, against Jake's protests, walked to the scorched area and aimed her camera down. That was when she gasped. Burned into the rock were symbols, geometric shapes arranged in a circle, pulsating faintly as though alive. Laura knelt beside her, horrified but fascinated. "This isn't random," she whispered. "It's a language." She reached out to touch one of the glowing lines and instantly jerked her hand back, screaming. The skin of her palm had blistered as though burned by fire, yet there had been no heat, only vibration. Jake dragged them away, shouting that none of it mattered, that they had to survive, but Sarah's eyes gleamed with something close to obsession. She whispered that maybe Eric was trying to send them a message, that maybe these symbols were him reaching out. That night they made camp on another ledge, though none of them truly believed sleep would come. Around midnight, Laura woke with a start and realized Sarah was gone. Jake and Laura scrambled through the darkness, calling her name, their voices bouncing against the cliffs. They found her standing barefoot in the middle of another scorched circle, camera clutched to her chest, eyes blank and unblinking. She didn't respond when they shouted, didn't flinch when Jake grabbed her shoulders. Finally, she whispered, in a voice that didn't sound like her own, "He says it's beautiful up there." Before they could drag her away, the hum returned, vibrating the ground so violently that loose rocks cascaded down the cliffs. A narrow beam of bluish light appeared, not from above, but from within the rock itself, rising upward like a column of water reversed. Sarah looked at Jake with tears streaming down her face. "I have to go," she whispered, and before he could stop her, she stepped into the beam. For an instant, her body flickered like a reflection in disturbed water, and then she was gone. The beam collapsed, the hum faded, and silence fell again. Jake and Laura stood alone on the mountain ledge, staring at the empty space where their last companion had stood, realizing with dawning horror that they might be the next ones chosen. Why the time dawn broke after Sarah's disappearance, Jake and Laura were no longer themselves. Their faces hollow, their voices thin, their bodies moving only because fear forced them forward. They climbed higher, not because they wanted to, but because every attempt to descend twisted them back to the same ledges and the same burned symbols etched into stone. Laura whispered that the mountain was alive, reshaping itself around them, and Jake could no longer argue. That morning the sky was unnaturally still, no wind, no birds, only the endless metallic hum that seemed to seep directly into their bones. Hours passed in silence until they reached the summit plateau, a barren crown of rock where no snow clung despite the altitude. From up there, the world below looked distorted, as if valleys and forests were painted illusions stretched across a canvas. In the center of the plateau stood something they could not explain, a structure, metallic and smooth, half buried in stone, shaped like a perfect black monolith. It pulsed faintly with red light, the same ominous glow they had seen on the craft. Jake wanted to run, but Laura, driven by terror and curiosity, staggered closer. "This is it," she whispered. "This is where they come from." As she reached out, the ground beneath them trembled and the hum became a roar. Above them, the sky tore open, stars bending into spirals as the triangular craft descended once more, so close that its edges cut across the horizon. A beam of blinding white light burst from its center and enveloped the monolith. Laura screamed, clutching her head, her eyes rolling back as if something was flooding her mind. Jake tried to pull her away, but her body stiffened, locked in the beam, and she looked at him with a calm, distant smile. "They showed me," she whispered. "They're not here for the mountain. They're here for us." Before Jake could respond, she was lifted from the ground, drawn upward in the same cold beam that had taken Eric and Sarah, her scream echoing only for a moment before it was cut off forever. Jake fell to his knees, broken, alone, staring up at the Leviathan in the sky. He screamed into the night, demanding they take him too, begging them not to leave him behind. But the beam retracted, the hum faded, and the craft shot into the stars, vanishing without a trace. Silence fell across the plateau. Hours later, a search team would claim they found Jake wandering at the base of the mountain, dehydrated, frostbitten, clutching a broken camera. He told them everything, but the footage, shaky, blurred, filled with lights and screams, was quickly taken by authorities and locked away. Official reports stated that 3 climbers had fallen during an accident, their bodies never recovered, their disappearance written off as tragedy. Jake's story was dismissed as hallucination caused by trauma and altitude. But Jake never stopped telling it, and those who heard him swear he never once changed the details. To his dying day, he insisted that what he saw on that mountain was real, that the government knew, and that the beings from the sky had chosen the others for reasons humanity could never understand. The Devil's Tooth remains closed to climbers, marked as too dangerous, though locals still whisper about strange lights dancing above its peak on moonless nights. And sometimes, on windless evenings, hikers say they hear voices echoing from the cliffs, distant, distorted cries calling for help, as if the ones taken were still out there, trapped between worlds, waiting for someone to listen.